Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wenqi Yu. With Trump returning to the White House for the second term, how will the U.S. project its power with its dominance in technology, energy, and finance sectors? Today's guest is Henry Farrell, author of Underground Empire: How America Weaponized the World Economy. Henry is also a professor at Johns Hopkins SAIS. TVBS will be publishing its Chinese version, 地下帝国：金融网络半导体，美国如何将世界经济武器化 later in March. Welcome, Henry.
I'm delighted to be with you. These are times when certainly a lot is going to be happening in the world of global coercion, and the book tells us a lot about, I think, what is going to unfold over the coming months.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, your book, it used past tense, weaponized, and I was gonna say, it is probably going to be weaponizing its economy even more. But tell us why you wrote this book, and what is the message that you were hoping to send to the readers?
So I think that Abraham Newman and I, my co-author, we both thought that in the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, we were really beginning to see some of the hidden systems of the world being revealed in a much more open way. So that for decades before this, the United States had been using economic coercion via the financial system, its control of dollar clearing, had also been using other means in order to try and get its strategic objectives across. And as long as this was happening in a world where there was a fair amount of agreement between the United States and its allies, this was something which could be done without people paying too much attention to it. But during the Trump administration, this became much more overt. In the first Trump administration, we saw much more willingness on the part of politicians to do this in a very crude and a very blunt way.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, you use the word economic coercion, which has been cited as how China is leveraging its economic power to impose its values or, sway its political influence. Would you say which side started this first?
So I think that these are always difficult things to figure out. Everybody blames everybody else. What I will say is that I think that there's some important differences between the kinds of coercion that the United States does and the kinds of coercion that China does. So if you look at China, China primarily uses its control of its domestic markets in order to try to punish countries that it doesn't like, so that
the control of access issue.
Exactly, right? Exactly. So that Australia says something that China doesn't like about coronavirus, and suddenly Australia discovers that its ability to export iron and other things to China disappears. But the problem with that is that this hurts China as well as hurting Australia. So you see China, after a year and a half, quietly abandoning some of its measures because it's just too tough for the economy. And where the United States has been able to benefit is that a lot of the things that it has done over the last 20 years has been done through effectively making it more difficult for foreign banks, for example, to do business with U.S. adversaries. And it uses the dollar clearing system and control of access to the US dollar effectively as a means to force banks to do its willing, whatever it wants them to do. And this is something that doesn't actually cost the United States very much. So China is in a situation where it probably has much more sweeping intentions than the United States has had to try and make other countries do its will. But it has much weaker weapons to do that with, whereas the United States has much stronger weapons, but has much of the time been prepared to be much less forceful in using these weapons. We did see much more forceful use during the first Trump administration, and I suspect we're going to see more forceful use during the second.
Yeah, for sure. We're going to see that. You mentioned the U.S. using its financial tools or weapons, and it's hurting the U.S. less. Obviously, it's because of the U.S. dollar's dominance in the world. Let's delve into that, how the U.S. has been using the financial clearing sort of mechanism to do that. Can you give a few examples? Especially if it's more recent, that's even better.
Okay, well, I'll give an example which is not entirely recent. It's from the first Trump administration, but it's Carrie Lam, who was the chief executive of Hong Kong. And so she found herself being sanctioned by the United States after the events in Hong Kong, where protesters were locked up and were treated very, very badly. And so Lam was sanctioned, and she found that she was not able to get Chinese banks to deal with her. So that according to a TV interview that she did, she had to have piles of dollars in various places, or piles of money in various places around the mansion where she lives, because she was forced to be paid in cash and to do everything that she did in cash, because no Chinese bank wanted to have anything to do with her. And so that really suggests how powerful this is, because if you are an international bank, you need to have access to the US dollar clearing system, because most trade either happens in dollars, which is true of a lot of trade, or it happens in currencies which are translated through the dollar. So you are buying something in Japanese yen, and the person who's selling is using euro. And in order to get from yen to euro, you are probably going to briefly translate it into dollars in the middle, because that is much more easy and convenient for all concerned. But that then means that if you are in control of the dollar in the middle, as the United States is, you can then say, actually, that transaction cannot happen. And if you block a bank from being able to engage in those kinds of transactions, suddenly it is actually not a international bank anymore, and it is likely to see a run on its deposits.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably the most powerful tool the US has right now in terms of its control of the global system. Let's also talk about technology, since the US has such a lead. What are some of the examples you want to share? You know, obviously you gave quite a few in your book, but I think, you know, let's use semiconductors as an example, since it's most relevant to Taiwan.
Yeah, semiconductors are incredibly important. And here, what the United States has done is it has tried, in effect, to turn the export control system, which is a system which is about the export of US technologies to other parts of the world. It has tried to turn that into an equivalent of its control over the dollar clearing system. Mm-hmm. And so, as it turns out, you know, the United States does not actually manufacture semiconductors nearly as much as it used to. TSMC, of course, is the world leader when it comes to the manufacture of sophisticated semiconductors. Samsung is somewhat behind it, but is a major competitor. And
since the United States no longer has the leadership position in manufacturing semiconductors, why does it still have so much power in controlling, or, you know, using your word, coercing other countries and companies to comply with its demands?
Intellectual property. So intellectual property is the key that the United States has been able to use, combined with its control over the companies which provide, for example, design software that actually allow you to lay out the semiconductors, and also certain kinds of materials that you need to produce semiconductors. So the United States still maintains control over these. And during the first Trump administration, it, of course, began to try to use these against Huawei, which is where the whole huge system that we have seen develop over the last number of years developed in actions that were being taken against Huawei. And so what it did then was it discovered that TSMC and other companies were willing, albeit somewhat grudgingly, to comply with US actions, but it turned out it wasn't nearly as effective as the US wanted it to be. So they came up with a new twist on export controls called the Foreign Direct Product Rule, which effectively meant that not only were you not allowed to make semiconductors with US intellectual property or with other US materials if they went past a certain small threshold, but you also were not allowed to make semiconductors or other things using equipment that had been manufactured with a certain amount of US intellectual property. And that really made it into a very, very sweeping set of controls. And one of the weird things that Abe Newman and I discovered when we were writing this book was Chris Miller, who's written a really good history of semiconductors, and who describes the moment when the Trump administration decided to do this. And apparently, according to the key official who Miller spoke to, my and Abraham Newman's work on weaponized interdependence, the work that gave rise to this book, was a major inspiration to the Trump administration in trying to figure out how to do this. We don't know how much that is right, because of course different officials might tell different stories. There probably is a more complex story here, but this is one of those incidents where you have an unexpected influence on the world, perhaps. And frankly, Abe and I have always felt a little bit nervous about that.
Yeah, I mean, I also want to talk about TikTok, the most recent I would say drama that just over the weekend. And it's quite interesting because using your framework to think about this topic, Trump has also been able to weaponize TikTok users as a leverage for a negotiation in order to hopefully get the parent company's ownerships to Americans' hands. How do you see this case then? Would you say, using your framework to explain it?
So I think that we would use our framework, but we would also need to use a different framework, because our framework is really a framework about how government is incredibly powerful. And how government can set the rules. And that clearly is an important part of the TikTok story. You see a story in which the US Congress passes a law,
yes,
which is very clearly intended to either ban TikTok or to force the sale. And then
I think forced sale is what they all have said. That's their goal.
Yeah, and then you see Donald Trump coming in, and a lot of complicated politics around that. But I think you also see another part of the story, which is how it is that TikTok itself has some agency in this. So TikTok, very clearly, it cuts off services during the last day of the Biden presidency, with more or less a message saying, help us, Donald Trump, only you can save us, a little bit like in Star Wars, you have this Princess Leia coming out of the R2-D2 droid. And then there is a message that comes to TikTok users a few hours later, President Trump has saved you. Isn't this wonderful? So I think what we're seeing here is an interesting mixture of the kind of power of government that we talk about, but also the ability of businesses like TikTok to try to manipulate that power in ways that allow them to get, if not exactly what they want, at least an outcome which is less bad than they feared it might be.
Can I just also question on that point? Wouldn't you say, because there's a lot of people who kind of feel that TikTok kind of has been colluding with the Trump team to make this sort of temporary out of service for people to feel the pain, but it was all sort of designed intentionally to feel that way. So would you say this is, in this case, using your framework, it may be even more sort of the US government, or at least the Trump team, is wielding its power to have TikTok behave this way?
I think that there is a mixture here. It's a really interesting story. And of course, there's a lot happening behind the scenes, which we're not able to see directly. But here's what I would say is happening. This is something which is interesting and unusual, is we are seeing a grafting together of the power of states and the power of business in the United States at the moment, which is in some ways unprecedented. So if you look at where these powers came from, that the United States has been using, these powers have been traditionally exercised for national security purposes. You may like or dislike what the United States does with them, but it's very, very clear that the United States has been using them on behalf of a vision of protecting the national security of the United States and going after adversaries. What I think we're going to see happening in the second Trump administration, which is quite different than the first Trump administration, is that these powers of weaponization are increasingly going to be blended together with the desires of specific, well-connected businesses to get what they want. And here, of course, when we look at the TikTok negotiations, it would appear from what we can tell that Elon Musk is playing a very, very important role in interceding between the United States and the Chinese government and TikTok. And so we can expect that whatever happens from this, it is not going to reflect simply or even perhaps primarily the national security interests of the United States. It is possibly going to reflect the commercial and business interests of Elon Musk and other people who are close to Donald Trump. And that's something that is quite new.
Yeah, you have said that this is unprecedented, but I think a lot of people, on Trump's side would say, decades ago, the U.S. Had this Manhattan Project, which, was able to bring together the private sector, especially the talent, to work closely with the United States government in order to develop some of the most powerful and influential tools the U.S. can use in the name of national security. And so, what they're doing is simply being smart again. And so there's, again, especially now with the AI technologies, there seems to be a desire to make the private industry more aligned with the U.S. government. Would you say so?
So I would disagree with those people. I think that you're exactly right about the debate that is happening, but I think that I would take the other side, which is that this is not so much about government aligning the private sector towards it. It's about the private sector aligning government towards it. So if you look at the Manhattan Project, if you look at Trinity, if you look at what Oppenheimer and other people did to organize this really was the government was in the driving seat, and the objective was a very clear national security objective. The bomb was never going to be privatized. There were clearly going to be some interests after the war, as there were in what Eisenhower later calls the military-industrial complex, where you have the defense industry and the role of science, and development going together. But equally, if you read what Eisenhower said in that speech where he condemns the military-industrial complex, and that speech is really, I think, where you get a very clear time capsule of what people were thinking there. His worry is not so much that we're going to see the private sector dominating. His worry is that in a world where everything is happening within the government space, where science is controlled by the government, that the kinds of innovation that we expect in the private sector is effectively going to be driven out. So that is not the problem I think we're going to see in a new administration with Donald Trump being very close to people like Elon Musk, Mark Andreessen, others who I think are playing a very important role. I think the worry there is that a specific vision of technology, which may in fact not be the correct vision of technology, and we could, if you want me to talk about AI, I've got plenty of opinions on the way that AI is developing. But so if you more or less, you have a clear capture of the US government by people who've got a very, very particular vision of how AI is going to work out in the next few years. And they have a lot of financial interests in the particular way that this is going to work out. And it may be that this turns out to be a good bet for their bottom line, for the bottom line of their companies, but maybe not a great bet from the point of view of the security of the United States.
Yeah, I think Donald Trump is a special case, right? Because you can question his motive behind, sort of trying to align the industry and the government. But the Biden administration was probably more clear in terms of its intention, using national security. And I do believe, some of the people on the team, prioritize national security and feel that the private sector needs to be more aligned. But, you also wrote that in your book, which is very interesting, that by emulating China, in the case of Huawei, right, sort of forcing or coercing other countries to cut ties with Huawei, the U.S. risks strengthening China's power. Can you explain what that means? And also, you said that it's even potentially going to be a greater danger, which is driving China to belligerence. And this is clearly not going to be the thinking of this Trump administration because it strongly believes in deterrence, and even, the Biden administration as well. So why do you write this kind of this point?
Okay, so I think there are two things here. One is the question of whether or not the United States is going to drive allies away from it, which is one worry. And the other worry is whether it is going to make China more belligerent. So these are two, I think, connected worries, two connected problems that you might have. And I think the first worry really stems from the fact that a lot of the reason why the United States is able to do what it is doing is inertia. That is that if you're another country, if you're another country's bank, and you're looking at the choices that you have, up to a point, you're prepared to go with what the US is doing because this is, because this is what you've always done, because you figure that having some stability, even if that stability is being used in ways that you don't like, is better than having no stability at all. But if we're in a situation, for example, where, as apparently has happened, Donald Trump is threatening allies such as Denmark, I'm sort of saying that he is going to impose perhaps not simply financial and economic weaponization, but even perhaps making threats that could be interpreted as being military threats to force Denmark to give up control of part of its territory. That puts other countries in a very, very different place, and in a place where they are going to start desperately looking for whatever alternatives they have to this system. And if you are a middle-of-the-road United States-based policy analyst, you may worry that this may drive them towards China because China is, in many ways, it is quite as predatory, or more so, but it is more predictable.
Yeah, I want to, let's focus on that point. I think, after the first Trump administration, we've seen that, the US wasn't a very popular actor on the world stage, even among the closest allies in Europe. However, they stick with the US, right? So, this question about whether US bad behavior is driving others toward China hasn't seemed to work. Partially, I think, China is not doing that well either. And there's a lot of behavior that, people feel some distaste around it. And using the example of Taiwan, for example, I think in Taiwan, there's definitely a growing sort of sentiment that is very suspicious, or I should say cynical about the United States. But, would it drive Taiwan toward Beijing? Also not happening. And, even more, actually, feeling this negative feeling about China. So that doesn't seem to work.
So well, certainly this is something that the Biden people, when they saw what Trump had done in the first administration, and they saw that, in fact, people had not withdrawn from the US dominated financial system in the way that they worried, this made them in turn less worried about what the possibilities might be. First, that's the first point. So I think that to some extent supports what you're saying. Equally, a big part of the first Trump administration was that there were officials who were effectively quite deliberately frustrating some of the things that Donald Trump did, and willing to, in effect, soften the blow. So you saw, for example, John Bolton, who was the national security advisor, at one moment where Trump wanted to do a deal with China over Huawei. So Trump says something, and Bolton and people around him managed to get that deal process effectively buried in a lot of bureaucratic red tape so that it never actually happens. So in effect, the first Trump administration was one where many of the wilder instincts of Trump were softened by people effectively deliberately frustrating what he was doing. Now we're in a world where Trump yesterday announced that he was withdrawing security protection from Bolton, who has been targeted by Iranian assassination efforts. And it's very clear that he is expecting a much higher degree of loyalty from his officials, and he's probably going to get it. So I think we're going to see a much wilder Trump in which some of these instincts, which really do have the potential to drive many allies, especially in Europe, who have more options away from him, those instincts are going to be on full display rather than softened.
I guess what I'm questioning you is more around, would other countries, given national interests, actually turn away from the US toward China? Is that even a possibility? And so, it comes down to probably just sheer power. And probably whether it's Trump or the US government feels that they're confident enough in terms of its power and influence that it's forcing other countries to do certain things that they believe they have to compromise, even if they don't like it, right? Because at the end of the day, out of national interest again, they don't really have other options, right? The question is, do they really have other options? In the case of Taiwan, does Taiwan have any other options? And I want to, sorry, I'll let you respond.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think Taiwan is a unique case because Taiwan is sort of less than 100 miles away from the People's Republic of China. Taiwan is dependent upon the continued military support and this extremely complex relationship that the United States and Taiwan have created over the last few decades, where there isn't, of course, recognition, but there is an implicit deal that the United States will continue to protect Taiwan. I think that really constrains what Taiwan's options are. Equally, if I were the Taiwanese government, I would be thinking as hard and as fast as I could about what kinds of measures to introduce in order to make sure that Taiwan is as unattractive a target as possible for China in a world where the United States decides to withdraw its support. Because you could see a world in which in which Donald Trump could plausibly decide that it was in the best interests of the United States not to be involved in this. There are people around him like Marco Rubio and others who are extremely hawkish, who I think would try to prevent that from happening. But if the president makes something a priority, it may be difficult to actually stop that from happening. I do think that we are going to see a different story in places like Europe, where I think there is, on the one hand, there is a much clearer degree of specific hostility on the part of Trump towards the European Union, which is identified as being effectively an enemy on many occasions, and where they are not quite as directly threatened by outside actors. Russia clearly is an important threat, but if the United States decides to withdraw its security protection, or even makes that security protection less of a given than it has been, Europe is probably going to want to start thinking about what it wants to do. And here, while I cannot imagine a world in which Europe becomes part of an envelope of protectorates of China, of countries that are protected by China, I can absolutely see a world in which Europe tries to hedge its bets more and more, tries to create alternative structures that insulate it from US power and from abuse by US power, and where the creation of those structures and the creation of those hedging arrangements limits US power in some quite unexpected ways. So I do think, I guess this is a standard professor answer, which is that I go on for 5 minutes in response to a short question. But I think the short version of what I'm saying is it is going to depend on the particular options that particular countries have. There's going to be a lot of variation. Taiwan is in a different place from Europe. But if you put countries' backs against the wall so that they feel like they have little alternative, they are going to start looking for whatever different ways that they have that they can minimize the power of the United States over them. And in a world where Donald Trump appears explicitly to be threatening military action against a NATO ally, that seems to be what happened in a conversation that he had with the Prime Minister of Denmark. That really is going to get a lot of conversations happening. The Munich Security Conference is about to happen, and there is going to be a lot of debate among politicians there about what this means and how to respond to it. And some of the answers they come up with may not be answers that particularly please the United States of America.
Yeah. So, with, again, the new Trump administration, I think your book, ends with the question how the underground empire, which is the United States, can grow toward the sun, the air, not darkness. What is your suggestion?
Well, I think that, this book was, that part of the book, I think, is probably written more for a world of Biden administration or a continued Kamala Harris administration than it is for the world that we're in. So I think that the best that we can hope...
You're very pessimistic right now.
Yeah. Well, I think that there are possible ways forward, but I think that the best ways forward is that you hope that there is going to be some degree of limit that the Trump administration is going to encounter, and that some of the more intelligent people within the Trump administration will realize that this extremely unilateralist way of doing politics, the idea, as a senior Republican said yesterday, that the United States is the, quote, top predator, unquote, and could do more or less whatever it wants, that this is not the way in which the United States can best preserve its power and its authority in the international system. I do think that there is some continuity that is going to happen between the Biden administration and some parts of the Trump administration, where you could see different voices emerging over time as, particularly if it becomes visible that some politics and some policies are disastrous. I think we could see some things beginning to bloom from that. But I think that we are in for a extremely difficult 4 years. I mean, in some ways, I think Abe and I had hoped that some of the things that we talk about in the book, some of the problems that we worry about, would become lesser over time. They're going to become starkly worse. And I think we're all going to be in a world where we're trying to figure out how to deal with a global economy, which is increasingly weaponized, where many of the things that we had hoped for with global trade, with interdependence, with the ability of companies like TSMC to really participate in a global marketplace, that is going to become much more politicized, much more difficult, and much more uncertain.
Well, that's for sure. I think, it'll be quite interesting to see what the next 4 years is going to look like, and not just in the United States, but also for the world, whether it will be an overreach for the Trump administration or the U.S. could come up and become even stronger as it's, wielding its underground empire networks. So thank you so much for joining us today. Again, Underground Empire will be in Chinese version, published in Taiwan in March. 地下帝国金融网络半导体，美国如何将世界经济武器化? TVBS will be publishing this book. Thank you, Professor Farrow, and take care.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful. Thank you.